there's a tendency in humans to be able to ride something to a certain point, but then there's a pendulum that brings you back. And it's kind of normal. Imagine with your children are being naughty, so you're a little severe with them, right? You're a little strict with them. If you're a good parent, what will normally happen is that, the next morning or a few hours later, you're going to go hug them. You're going to overemphasize the affection because you want to find that kind of balance. And this is just how humans are made. I think storytellers recently have not been very attentive to that and not realized that if you tell the Star Wars story for long enough, what's going to happen is some people are going to want to know the perspective of the Empire, and it's just going to happen. You can't stop that. It's just how the world functions. People all shocked that young teenagers are taking, American Psycho as their hero. They don't understand that if you push too hard, you distort too much, you create this kind of propaganda messaging, then it's going to swing. There's no way around it. So rather integrate that into the storytelling. Tell a Western where you can understand the perspective of the people coming west with their wagons and of the native population that is being pushed in. And if you tell a beautiful story where you have characters on both sides, then it's something that is deeper to the human experience than a simple-minded, one-sided propaganda story.
This is Jonathan Pajot. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
Hey everyone, I'm Stephen Roach. I'm host of the Makers and Mystics podcast, and I'm thrilled to have with me on the show today writer, artist, and public speaker Jonathan Pajot. In our conversation, Jonathan and I discussed the nature of storytelling, fairy tales, art, and this cultural moment, and a sneak peek into what Jonathan's going to be sharing at the upcoming The Breath in the Clay Creative Arts event, taking place March 20th through 22nd in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy the conversation. Jonathan, thank you for joining me today on the Makers and Mystics podcast.
It's great to be here. It's a pleasure.
This is actually your second time on the podcast, but it's been a few years since we last connected. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, our last conversation, we talked about superheroes and the symbolism of the superhero. And I think even The Walking Dead at that time, we talked about the zombie apocalypse.
It's been a while ago. Nobody cares about superheroes or zombies anymore.
That's exactly right. What's funny is this was pre-pandemic. And we were talking about zombies and The Walking Dead, and then suddenly we found ourselves in the apocalypse and The Walking Dead.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. It's really interesting. You're right. I know we're just being playful here, but my buddies and I, we go to the movies often. And, the last time we went to the movies, we came away and we were just like, are there any heroes anymore? Or does the hero exist? And even the anti-hero has kind of become cliche now. And it's like, you go to these movies and there's a lack of a narrative arc, it seems like. There's no character transformation. It's hard to find a character that you care about. And if you do care about him, often I don't see a lot of transformation. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. I think that our narrative world is exhausted, and you see it in Hollywood, but it's just everywhere. Everything is recycled, and people don't know what story to tell anymore. So it's a sad time in some ways, because it's true. I mean, you can be on Netflix and you don't know, you can scroll for 30 minutes, have no idea what to watch. You look at what's offered at the movie theater and there's just nothing interesting to watch. And so it is a sign of narrative exhaustion. But it is at the same time an opportunity. That is, it's in this moment when something new and bright will appear. It's just sometimes hard to know where it's going to come from and how it's going to manifest.
Yes. Well, I know that so much of your work deals with, looking into the symbols and the tropes of culture. And I know you talk a lot about this on the Symbolic World, but I'd be curious to hear, do you think that this exhaustion of the narrative in film and in storytelling, is this indicative of where we are in culture as far as some of the larger narratives that we've abandoned, or why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult subject because it's a little touchy, but really what it is the end of what we could call the World War II narrative. That is, with the people that were there during World War II dying and the strong impetus that the war gave to our world, it created a type of story. I mean, that story existed before, but let's say it focused on a certain kind of story. We could call it the revolutionary story, the underdog story. It's the story of the Allies, right? It's the story of the ragtag group of people that come together and fight the empire. It's the Star Wars story. It's pretty much every single narrative that we've had since World War II has been mostly that story. And when a story that's different from that appears, it's really shocking because it has another shape. If you remember when Starship Troopers came out, nobody knew what to think. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew what to do because it was actually kind of supposed to be a type of irony, but it was so different from the narrative that we're used to seeing. We didn't know how to deal with it. And so that is what's going on, is that in some ways it's just normal that when you have a type of story for a very long time, at some point the thrust of that story begins to wane. And also what you could call the side effects of the narrative begin to show themselves, right? When you start something at the beginning, anything, you always see the reason why you're doing it, right? You see a lot of the energy. So the energy is strong behind it. And as you move forward, at some point you start to lose that energy, and then you start to see the side effects and the unplanned consequences of what it is that you were doing. So I think that if you look at the kind of excessive focus on diversity that we've seen in the past decade, kind of an excess on rainbow culture and all that stuff, like that's the end of the World War II story. It's like we want diversity so much that diversity just becomes so exploded that it doesn't hold the world together anymore. And so that's what we're seeing. But I don't know. It's hard to know what's going to come out of it, because you don't want a swing of the pendulum. You don't want it to like say, oh, okay, kind of, I always say it's kind of like Weimar, right? At the end of Weimar, we had a similar situation where there was a type of storytelling that we have been dealing with for a few decades, and then you swing towards a kind of authoritarian story. So I think one of the things that I'm the most concerned about is how can we bring back true balanced storytelling, right? True, full kind of epic religious storytelling, really in the best way, because the stories in Scripture and the stories, the more ancient stories, they're balanced. They're not just one-sided. They're not ideological. They have a thrust, but even the stories in the Bible, people often don't realize it. You can actually often understand the motivations of all the characters, even those that are like the bad guys in the story. You can tell the story of Exodus from the point of view of the Pharaoh, and it's completely coherent. You totally understand, you don't have to agree with him, but you can kind of understand why the Pharaoh is doing what he's doing. And so that's what I'm hoping for. That's why we're focusing on fairy tales, in my own kind of publishing company, trying to kind of bring back these old stories because they're the best solution to the swing of the pendulum.
Well, lean in that a little bit more for me, because I know that your recent work does deal with fairy tales, and I'm super excited because I think at The Breath in the Clay, you'll have some of your new work to share with the community there. I'd love to know more about that, and then just dive more into why fairy tales right now.
Well, one of the things that we've seen is, you could say that the guardians of our fairy tales, Disney has been the biggest guardian of the fairy tales since even before World War II. And they started to drop them. Actually, they realized that they don't really want them because they don't like the stories. And so first they tried to twist them and to turn them and to make them into their ideological vehicle. But at some point, people got tired of that. And when I heard that they were going to remake the Snow White in live action, this was like not back in 2020 or even before that. When I just heard of the project, I knew that they couldn't. I knew that they couldn't do it. I knew that they couldn't have the kiss. They couldn't have the dwarves. There's so many things in the story that they just couldn't do. And therefore I thought, okay, to me, it was like a sign that we need to kind of take the stories back and tell them with a kind of celebration and in a tone of memory, like of memory and celebration, instead of cynicism and twisting. So that's how it started the project. So we've already published three fairy tales, and we're going to publish 7, 8, or 9 when we're done. And we're doing them very beautifully, kind of heirloom quality books with world-class illustrators, trying to kind of do something. And also, even like children's literature is so horrible now. Everything has been kind of reduced to throwaway books, and stories that are so simple, and there's this idea of like almost dumbing down because children can't understand. If you read the old stories, there was no dumbing down. And I remember when I read the Jungle Book when I was maybe like 14. And I remember really liking it. And my teacher saying, that was written for 10-year-olds, that back in the day, it wasn't for your age, but now we're so used to dumbing down. So that's the idea, is to make them beautiful and kind of bring out some of the images that people hadn't noticed, images that are related to scripture, also related to kind of the Christian message.
Yeah. And so these fairy tales, these are your retelling of the story. Is that what this is?
So basically, they're a kind of retelling of the story where we follow the story beats. We kind of respect the story, and but like I said, what we're doing is in some ways pulling out certain elements that are relevant to now and trying to help people see. Because I grew up in a world where I was told the fairy tales are just pagan, right? These are pagan stories. Why are you interested in these stories? Because they're not Christian. And, my investigation into them showed me that they are quite Christian, actually, and that they are seeped in Christian storytelling. And so one of the things I want to do is to pull out those threads. Like in Snow White, you know that story. The woman eats an apple and she dies, like we've heard the story before. But what's the connection? Why does Snow White have that story? What's its connection to the Garden of Eden? And the idea is, how can we pull on some threads in the story to make that more shiny, you could say, for people to be able to see it.
Yeah.
I said I would never do it again, but here we are. We are announcing the Symbolic World Summit in May 2026. I have so many great people around me that I'm just excited to do it, even though I thought it would be crazy to do it again.
Our summit's going to be from May 14th through 16th in Broadview Heights, Ohio. You can buy tickets at symbolicworldsummit.com. We have early bird pricing going right now, $50 off of general admission and VIP tickets. Keynote speakers this year are Father Josiah Trenham and Dr. Mary Harrington, which is a combination nobody knew that they wanted, but I think is going to be absolutely incredible. And of course, Jonathan and I will be speaking, as well as several people from around the Symbolic World community.
A lot of people that you like, that you've seen, are going to be there, are going to come. We're going to have book signings. It'll be a lot of time for people to meet and to greet. We're also doing Supra as well. And so come and join us. We can't wait for this, and we're excited to meet you in person.
You said something earlier that really piqued my interest, and you talked about ideology and ideological threads, even in biblical stories, how they portray a whole picture. Like you mentioned the Pharaoh, you could tell the same story from a different perspective, and you still see what was going on there. I'm really interested in how art and ideology connect, because, for instance, like, one thing that I've noticed is that it feels like this line between art and propaganda gets really blurry these days. And I'm interested in understanding how, the arts can be a vehicle of cultural commentary and cultural critique without falling into propaganda. And it just seems like our cultural moment is one that is very suspicious of any form of art or anything that does not have a blatant, ideological stance on it, whether it's a secular ideological stance or an extremist right, stamp of approval on it. We've got these kind of triggers. But when I look at fairy tales, they seem to have a passport to bypass a lot of what we see in our modern day. I wonder if you could speak into that a bit.
Yeah, I think that it's okay for art to sometimes be social commentary. That is completely fine. It's something that's always existed. If you think of, if you remember in the time of Socrates, the frogs play that was mocking Socrates, like there is a role for art to in some ways be a social commentary. But I think the problem that happens is when then things are reduced to social commentary. When things become just a vehicle for messaging, then it's the equivalent, like you said, it's basically propaganda. Now, what's interesting, what's great about propaganda is that it's boring. It's actually, people don't like it. And so it's actually very short-lived. When you try to push art too much towards propaganda, at some point, people get tired of it and just don't want to look. And so, obviously the communists could force you to look at it. The communists could force you to look at their propaganda. But luckily we live in a world that still you can't force someone to go see a movie. You can't force them to read books, maybe in high school a little bit. So what's interesting is that I think that naturally things now will start to move kind of away from propaganda if they want to be able to gather people's attention again. It doesn't mean that works won't have a certain smell or a certain, a certain direction, you could say, even in terms of their political leaning, and that's not wrong. And so I think that that's it. We just have to find a way to and people's attention. And people's attention, especially if you think of the attention long term, sometimes you can get people's short term attention with a lot of scandal and like kind of a political, a political mallet, you could say. But if you want to create culture that has a kind of long term, let's say a long term vision, then you have to be able to, let's say, tap into deeper patterns. So, like a simple example, I love Matt Walsh as much as anyone, but he wrote this children's book that was basically just like a political mallet, right? It's just a political hammer. And so, he probably sold a lot of books, but like who even remembers that book at this point? Nobody remembers it because it was just reduced to a kind of social commentary. The thing that's wild though is that in some ways Hollywood, because it's like such massive budgets, the idea that you would make, $100 million propaganda, it was a really bad idea because propaganda will always fall on one side. And if you want to make movies that have such big budgets, you have to like kind of put in something for everyone in there. So hopefully we're going to see better. I think we're going to see better times come pretty fast. I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so as well. It's one question that comes to mind, because I think every work of art is created from a particular stance, or it's created from a particular view of the world, even if it's not apparent, through the symbolism and through the narrative. But I'm really curious how religious art and how, storytelling and fairy tales and how these things can carry the spirit or the worldview or the stance that is true to your value system and to the things that you hold true without it waxing into the moral of the story type of thing. How do we create works of art that are true to the spirit in which they're created without it just falling into the same ideological or propaganda that we're talking about here?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happens is the multiplicity of stories, at least for Christians. If you know a lot of the Bible stories, what will happen is that the balance will set itself up, because even without you realizing, there are certain tropes in the Bible stories that will be played in different ways, and so a good example, for example, in scripture is the strange woman. It's a great example because it's kind of there all through the Bible, and so there are warnings against the strange woman. Solomon warns you against her because she'll take your things and she'll give it to the stranger, and then you see these iterations of the strange woman. If you think of Delilah with Samson, if you think of Jezebel, but then you have another strange woman. Then all of a sudden you have Ruth, and she's different from the other strange woman. And then you have, for example, the prostitute in Jericho. What's her name? Oh my goodness, it's horrible. Rahab, right? She is very much the strange woman, but she is some ways kind of helping you in your project. And so this is just one simple image, but what happens is in the Bible, you'll have characters like this to play certain roles, and the story will play itself out in different ways. And so, for example, Rahab, what she's doing to Jericho is equivalent to what Delilah is doing to Samson. But in the case of Jericho, Jericho is evil, and we're happy to see Jericho fall. In the case of Samson, we don't want Samson to fall. So you can actually see that it's the same pattern being played out in different ways. And that's what powerful storytelling does, is that it kind of understands that, it's not just one simple moral line, that actually there's the kind of complexity in the storytelling where different characters play different roles, and depending on circumstance, you can still see the pattern without only seeing it in one direction. So it's the same with fairy tales. So you'll have fairy tales, for example, like Little Red Riding Hood that we just published, in which we really talk about the stranger danger, right? It's like, here's a wolf that's pretending to be a woman who is going to devour you, okay? And so it's very relevant to what's going on in the world today. But you'll have other fairy tales that will treat, the stranger as a place of discovery, as a place of treasure, as a place where there's things that new things that you can learn or discover. And so that's how the ancient stories did it, is that either you can have a great epic, let's say like the Iliad, where you can read the Iliad from the point of view of the Greeks or from the point of view of the Trojans, and it's a completely coherent story. You can actually identify with characters on both sides, and there's this very deep tragedy. Or you can have several stories that play with each other and interact with each other, and that ultimately create a kind of balance in the end.
It seems like that way of approaching storytelling puts more trust in the audience than, more of a propaganda-driven thing that's like, well, here, we're going to tell you what to believe. We're going to tell you where to land. We're going to make it so clear you don't really have a choice or a place to participate. But then, this holistic kind of view of storytelling that has a multiplicity of perspectives, coming to the table, it seems like it's much more robust and allows the audience to participate with it. And it also leaves room for the reader or for the audience member to draw their own conclusions. And that's something that I've always thought was characteristic of some of the best works of art, or even music, like when I can enter into the story myself, when I can enter into the art myself, and not abuse it beyond what was intended, but to enter into it and have my own experience with it. Would you say that that's kind of a characteristic of what you're talking about as well?
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely right. And there is, a tendency in humans to, it's just natural. Like there's a tendency in humans to be able to ride something to a certain point. But then there's a pendulum that brings you back, right? It's like, and it's kind of normal. Imagine with your children are being naughty, so you're a little severe with them, right? You're a little strict with them. If you're a good parent, what will normally happen is that, the next morning or a few hours later, you're going to go hug them. You're going to overemphasize the affection because you want to find that kind of balance. And this is just how humans are made. And I think storytellers recently have not been very attentive to that and not realized that if you tell the Star Wars story for long enough, what's going to happen is some people are going to want to know the perspective of the Empire, and it's just going to happen. You can't stop that. It's just how the world functions. People all shocked that young teenagers are taking, American Psycho as their like hero. They don't understand that if you push too hard, and you make fun of too much, and you distort too much, you create this kind of propaganda messaging, then it's actually, it's going to swing. There's no way around it. So rather integrate that into the storytelling, right? Tell a story, tell a Western where you can understand the perspective of the people coming west with their wagons, and of the native population that is being pushed in. And if you tell a beautiful story where you have characters on both sides, then it's something that is deeper to the human experience than a simple-minded, one-sided propaganda story.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that is so needed for the art world, and especially for artists who are coming from a platform of faith, or coming from a root system of faith. I think knowing that there is that freedom to create works that are robust, that do lean into some difficult topics. That's why I've often really appreciated writers like Flannery O'Connor and some of these authors that were willing to go into the dark places, but and also to leave room for the audience and for the reader to participate in it. Because, on the one hand, like we were talking about, some modern cultural art can wax into propaganda or into a flat. The same thing can happen in a different way for religious artists who feel like that there is the narrative, because we have the scripture and because the story is there, we don't feel the freedom to, whether it's exploring it through new symbols, through new metaphors. In your case, going back to some of the ancient stories that they were told to you that they were all pagan. What good is there in them? I think that for religious artists, they can feel that pressure to stay too tightly bound into what's already been stated, and so for an artist, it can make some feel like, what more is there for me to explore? Does that make sense? Like, because the artist is really driven by curiosity to push the status quo and to go beyond the bounds. And I think whether it's through propaganda or religious stories that are already told from beginning to end, sometimes it can be challenging to find creative freedom in that world.
So obviously I'm an icon carver, at the outset. And so I see a hierarchy, in terms of participation in these stories. I do think that when dealing with something that's sacred, like the Bible itself, and I think ultimately some of the holy images that are in the Christian tradition, I think you have to be very cautious. You have to treat them with a kind of reverence and respect, because I've seen sometimes people, I won't name anything, but there's some people that, like, let's say, make actual Bible stories into other media, and then at some point, it's like, you're not wiser than the text.
Totally,
you're not wiser. Your version of this character, watch out, because you're not as holy as that person, and you're not, and so sometimes it becomes a little difficult to to engage with the actual, let's say, Bible stories, and to engage directly with the holy things. But I really see it rather as downstream from that. There are all kinds of things that you can do and that you can kind of express, and so, let's say Dante, even in the Middle Ages, like, Dante would never have rewritten the liturgy. He wouldn't have, changed what's on the crucifixion, but he was willing to create an amazing poem that wasn't used in church. That was something that was expressing all these truths and all of these kind of deep understandings of the cosmos and of Revelation, but in its proper kind of place, let's say, in its proper. And so, at least for me, that's it. That is very important for me to do. Like, I wouldn't, for example, like the fairy tales that I'm telling, they are kind of pointing back to scripture, pointing back to the Bible, but I wouldn't want anybody to read those in church. Like, I would just feel very awkward.
Context matters. Yes.
It's like, exactly. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because as you were talking about that, I began thinking about Del Toro's Frankenstein that just recently came out. And even though that's not like a sacred text or a religious text, it's a very well-known story. It's a historical story. And whereas I loved the movie, I mean, the movie was very moving to me, I also recognized that he veered way away from Mary Shelley's text, like with some of the characters and Elizabeth and William, like. And so what's the point between reinterpretation and then no longer honoring the integrity of the original text? Like, what about that line there?
Yeah. Well, there is in some ways a natural process by which this will be weaned, you could say. And so I think that Del Toro's Frankenstein, it is Del Toro. That is, Del Toro loves monsters. Del Toro has believes in that monsters are better than us. Like he really believes that. If you watch Shape of Water, you realize that that's his basic take. And so he thinks that hybridity and that, that kind of is a form of innocence, right? It's always, the monster is always acted upon. The monster is a victim. Like it really is like the World War II, let's say, story, like all taken to its extreme, right? And so, for that reason, I think that his Frankenstein movie was, like you said, it was beautiful. I mean, it's hard to deny how beautiful the film was, but I do believe that having the woman fall in love with the monster, and then having Victor Frankenstein do all the evil that the monster does in the actual novel, I think is a deep mistake in terms of understanding what the story is about. And what's going to happen is that his retelling will have a shorter life than a deeper, more kind of balanced retelling, because everybody knows deep inside them that monsters can kill you. That monsters are dangerous. It doesn't mean that monsters don't have their function, and that you can't have a story of a monster that has a form of participation or a form of innocence. But monsters are also very dangerous, and Mary Shelley tells a much better version. And so what happens, like, let's take it like very simply. So Del Toro shows the sin of Victor Frankenstein as the kind of arrogant, hubris of the Faustian kind of character that tries to create his own life and to create the thing on his own. And so there's a sin in Victor Frankenstein. Clearly there's a sin. But then when he creates the monster, now the monster is innocent and the monster is pure. Now think about it. Now apply this to AI and see if it holds. Oh, so it means we're hubristic. We might create this monster, but AI is not dangerous. How could AI be dangerous?
Right.
That's insane. It's like you realize that he's not. He's just taken up by one line, and he's not understanding why these stories exist and how they're applicable to our situation. And it's true of any technology. The idea that you would create a technology with hubris, and then the technology now is purely innocent and purely without any fault and can't destroy us and won't create all kinds of chaos, But because because the analogy in the story is a monster, and because Del Toro is obsessed with monster and hybridity and has a kind of desire for that type of character, then he can't see. He has kind of blinders on, and his story becomes extremely limited in its scope.
Yeah. That's really fascinating, bringing it to the topic of AI, and of course, the topic of art and AI is of great concern to a lot of artists right now.
And you bet. My goodness.
And that's something that we're even wrestling through in our community, and just so many musicians are very concerned about it. But when you're talking about the monster and there's this innocence that's put on the monster, it goes back to what you said earlier, where if you push too hard, for this particular kind of character, then suddenly there's going to be more interest in the monster or in the antihero, these things. Do you think that a lot of the modern storytelling is simply reactionary against pushing too hard? Is that kind of what you sense in a lot of the storytellings that we're faced with now? There's a lot of nihilism in it, of course, that I see, but there is almost like, it almost seems like it's fueled by pushing back against the idea of the hero.
Yeah, well, our world is you could say our world is a revolutionary world. Most of our stories are revolutionary. Most of the stories we have understand identity and authority as being oppressive and tyrannical in itself. And therefore, even when we tell the story of our heroes, think about most of our superhero stories. Our superhero stories are all they're not official. They're mostly on their own, right? They're individuals. They're completely different from each other. If you think of the Justice League and you look at them, it's like, oh, you have an alien from Mars, you have a Hawkman from another planet, you have some person from Krypton, you have a guy who dresses as a bat. It's like, this
sounds
is
like
not
the Breath in the Clay community.
like, this is not the military. Like, this
Right.
is a a kind of ragtag group of people from the outside that are fighting monsters, right? So this is our story. It's a completely legitimate story. To talk about resistance to tyranny, all of that is completely legitimate. But that has been the story that we've been telling for now, since the end of World War II. And I think that in some ways now we don't know what to do because it's devolved into the type of nihilism. Because there is a thrust in resistance to tyranny, but if you push that too hard, like you said, it turns into the idea that any form of identity, any form of cohesion,
Yes.
we should be cynical against.
Yes.
And that's where the nihilism comes in, and that's where it leads to despair.
Yes. That's really fascinating, and I mentioned this to you before that I've just written a book called How to See Invisible Things, and it's coming out in October. But in one of the chapters, I talk about this book. In fact, I've got it right here. It's called Mona Lisa's Mustache by Mary Sedagist. And she talks about the dissolution of forms. Like it goes past Max Weber and disenchantment and, secular humanism and things like that. But she takes it a step further and she begins to see the dissolution of forms. And that was really fascinating to me. Even as we're having this conversation, you've mentioned a lot about the world post World War II and how
it was there before, though, like you said, because that the idea of Mona Lisa's mustache is a reference to Duchamp.
Duchamp, yes.
And so it was all there before, but it's just that there was competition, you could say. There was competition between two extremes before World War II. People don't even realize, even in terms of visual artists, that the Italian futurists were fascists. Like that many of the modernists, even Dali was a fascist. And so like a lot of the modernists, there was a competition between a kind of more fascist ideology and a more kind of revolutionary communistic thinking. And then after World War II, with the abstract expressionists, it's like one story, there was just one. And it was that one. It was the one of the resisting form and resisting identity and resisting tradition, and it was completely coherent. Like it made sense because the Nazis were bad, and we had to fight them. It made complete sense. But you're right that now it's led to, the very dissolution of forms,
It's interesting because, identity is tied to form. In art is tied to limitation. It's distinct. In order to have an identity, there has to be distinction. There has to be a shape. There has to be the edge of the canvas. The choice of this set of notes and not this note. So it's a very interesting thing that when you begin to break down all sense of identity and form, you also move past abstract art and go into something that is much different than that, I think.
Well, for sure. I mean, ultimately our art now is a form of pop art. Everything that we're doing is a kind of is a fusion of pop art and surrealism. That is, it is a kind of desire to invert the hierarchy of the relationship of art, right? The natural kind of idea that there are some forms that are true and that you embody them. There's this kind of reversal, and then there's a kind of explosion of the imaginary, in parentheses, you could say, where a kind of anything goes. But what's super interesting in terms of fine art is to understand that that's actually not how the world works, right? So the world actually does have form, and the world actually does have a kind of natural hierarchy. And so what happens when you try to create something like contemporary art is that there's a hidden hierarchy. There's a meta hierarchy that will set itself up. You can't avoid it. And then that meta hierarchy will be won't show itself in the work, but will be all surrounding it, which will be an insane system of galleries and of collectors with a lot of money and a lot of influence that are deciding what gets attention and what doesn't. And the reason for what gets attention and what doesn't has less to do with what's actually on the wall or what's actually there than their own kind of economic advantages and how they get together and then they speculate on artists, and then they bring them, they agree on with each other on how much to pay for certain pieces of art so that the price goes up. That's what's hidden behind the art market, folks. It's like there's a whole story of power and prestige and a kind of social elites that decide what it is that's acceptable. So there always form and there's always hierarchy. Whether or not you know what it is, it's going to be there. You can't avoid it.
Wow. That's amazing. That's eye-opening.
I know, it's like, especially as an artist, it's like it's not fun to realize
Yes.
that collectors will put a piece up at auction and then tell each other who's going to buy it, but to make sure you bid so that you bring the price up. When you hear of some like piece of art that's sold for $20 million or a Basquiat sold for $100 million. And you're thinking, how could Basquiat, who died, 30 years ago, sell for $100 million? Well, it's because, and now that one has sold for $100 million, all our paintings are worth more. And so it's a system to create value through this type of kind of, it's like inside trading in art is like, it's the only one that's not illegal. Like inside trading in art is completely legal and they do it all the time.
Wow. So then I guess what my question comes to mind for me.
I'm like the one I'm like disillusioning all the artists who will be watching this. They'll be like, oh no, Jonathan, is that really how it works? Yes, I'm sorry. That really is how it works.
Well, it's almost unavoidable that we work inside of systems, and most of the time the systems are not systems that we decided upon. We're kind of thrust into these different worlds, and then we have to figure out how to navigate our way through it. And I think for some artists, it's very overwhelming, and it's very disillusioning in many ways.
But I think that one of the things that I want to give everybody hope now, because now it's just massive amounts of despair. I think one of the things that is going to happen, with AI art is that, of course, a lot of the mediocre art is going to go away. That's just going to happen. It's kind of sad, but there will be less artists. That'll just be almost inevitable. But it will also put value back on the actual human-made thing, which is that because now anybody can do anything. Some of the recent ones, like what's this new model? I forget what it's called. It's insane. Like one prompt, and you just get a 5-minute, you get like a 30-second movie basically. That's really almost has the quality of anything you could see in Hollywood. That type of drivel and that type of reduction to the kind of democratization of everything of anything is going to make the person that can draw a human hand very beautifully is going to make that more valuable. And so for people that are attentive and that are careful, there will be new markets that will appear, and there'll be a new love of things that are genuine. And I think we have to capitalize on that. Like if you look at our books, our fairy tale books, we're going the opposite direction of AI. We're saying we're going to make these heirloom quality books, with foiling and quality paper, beautiful colors, and so we're just saying no. We're like people like people. And so let's tell the story of the illustrator. Let's tell the story of the person writing it. As the AI slop kind of starts to drown us, people are going to be looking for real connection.
Totally. Yeah, I kind of came up with this little phrase where I said, analog is the new punk rock.
Well, my daughter who's 15, she's 15, right? So she basically, as she became a teenager, which is when you start to really listen to music, she had access to every single song that has ever been made, through Spotify. And so what does she want? Well, she wants a record player.
Yes.
And what did she ask for Christmas? She asked for her favorite albums
Mm-hmm.
on vinyl, because exactly what you're saying. It's like when we start to drown, we look for something real to float,
That's
something
right.
that's kind of solid to float.
Yes. That actually brings me around to our Breath and Clay community and what we're doing here. And, one of the things that we've wanted to offer through our events and through our community is that human connection. And I mean, we do have, digital, virtual offerings the same as anybody else. But one thing that we really wanted to do, and our team talked about it, we're like, what can we offer that you can't get anywhere else, that you can't get? What are we hungry for that we're not going to find it through virtual situations? And it really is that community time of coming together, face-to-face time. We did a poll after our last event. What did you like? Where do we need to improve? What worked? What didn't? And across the board, out of 400 or 500 people, they wrote back and they said the one thing we want more of is just time to connect with one another. We loved the performances, we loved the presentations, but we want more community time. And so that was just telling to me that analog is the new punk. It's like, we're looking for time to be human with one another. We're looking for art that is human, and to really dive into that. I want to get you, as we come to our time here, I want to get you to comment a bit on this theme that we're working with this year, because it's born out of the conversation that we've had this whole hour here, where we're talking about, everything is so saturated and so much noise in the culture right now. The theme that we came up for this year is a bit counter to that. The theme is making space. And we're kind of looking at that word making as part of the creative process, that we're actually making space. And I'm curious for you, both as your work in cultural critique and as an iconograph. I can never say that word right.
I can't
either.
I can't say it. Iconographer.
Iconographer, there it is. Both your work as an artist and as a cultural voice. What do you think about, and why does making space matter for the artist and just for us as humans in general right now?
Yeah, I think that this is it's actually a very important theme, in the Bible. When you see St. John the Baptist, he says, make straight. When he talks about making straight the way of the Lord, what he's talking about is, cutting off the dead branches, right? He's saying you have to destroy. There's an aspect of the world when it's an idol, when it's false, when there's false attention, when there are things that are distracting us in the worst way, that we actually have to rid ourselves of. And so the purification of the space, you see that also when the Israelites are building the tabernacle, or when we're building the temple, and it is like you said. It's the aspect that we usually don't think of. We usually think of making something in terms of fabricating or of gathering elements together, to reveal something. But before you do that, the first thing you often have to do is a kind of creative destruction, where you have to be willing to rid yourselves of the false patterns, right, of the Pharaoh's tyranny, and then move towards something where you can actually kind of encounter the revelation, or kind of encounter the Spirit. That, by the way, that is what baptism is, right? Baptism is you go down into the water, right? You go down into the pure chaos, and you come back up with all this extra stuff off. It's like washing, right? All the stuff that doesn't belong there goes away, and now you're ready for the Spirit to kind of come down on you. And so I think it's a beautiful theme, and it is one, especially in a world where we are saturated by images, we're saturated by the AI slop, like we're completely, overwhelmed by images and by stories, and everybody's trying to get our attention, to think, no, before we kind of come together, before we actually create something valuable, we have to be able to have a little bit of destruction, a little bit of like leveling, so that we open up the space. So I think it is very, very appropriate. It's hard to imagine something that would be better at this moment.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Well, Jonathan, I am looking so forward to having you with us in March. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me on the Makers and Mystics podcast today, and I can't wait to get one of the fairy tale books in hand, and maybe I'll get you to sign it for me when you're here. But thank you again for coming back on the podcast.
Oh, I'm definitely looking forward to being there with you.